Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Happy Friday, everyone. This is our latest episode of Marty Kaiser's Real Estate Tidbits. Hope everyone is having a great Valentine's Day and enjoy it. And hopefully your loved ones have received a Valentine's Day present from you. As I mentioned, we had skipped last Friday's podcast and looking forward to getting back online. I wanted to go over a few different categories as always. The first thing I'll start off with is a little bit of statistical data that I've been doing research on. And one of the things that I've noted in our local market is the market looks like there's a good likelihood it's going through a transition. What I mean by a transition, for really the past 14 years, we've had a shortage of inventory, and for the most part, it's been a seller's market. And that's the primary reason why prices have gone up so much from the early 2011 and 12 to the current level. The reason that I say it's starting to transition is a couple reasons. The primary one is the difference in listing inventory, for example, in a big area like Hunters Creek, increased over 30% from the middle of February of 25 to what had taken place in January. So that was a significant increase. And our inventory level at the same time in Hunters Creek is the highest level it's been since prior to COVID. So that's great for buyers. The flip side of that is that buying activity really hasn't adjusted yet. Buyer activity has stayed relatively flat. So if listing inventory keeps increasing and buyer activity stays reasonably flat, what that's going to indicate is we're going to transition to a market that puts buyers in a much better position. So what that means basically is that buyers can be more selective. It's going to put more of an emphasis on sellers of properly and realistically pricing their homes, and also to maximize the staging of homes, because as there's more selection, buyers are going to be more discerning on what they place offers on, and at the same time, they're going to look more stringently at any potential negatives that a property has, and that's going to come across in their negotiating strategy. So you're going to see a lot more negotiations going on. So I wanted everybody to be aware of that. If you're a buyer, again, it's going to be a great time to purchase, even though interest rates are still high right now. You're going to get all these factors that are going to put you in a much more advantageous position. And as I've previously mentioned, interest rates will go down. They might not go down quite as rapidly as we had hoped, but they will go down. And when they get down to a level that makes economic sense for a buyer, then you can refinance the property. But what you've accomplished is you've gotten the house that you really wanted, that met all your needs, and you're going to pay a much more realistic price for the house, not like it was a couple years ago where people were paying tremendous premiums for houses. Just to give you another barometer of that, for the past 90 days of closings, again, I'll pick out Hunters Creek since I obviously do a lot of business in Hunters Creek. Of the 18 closings in the past 90 days in Hunters Creek, the average market time slightly increased to 52 days. It wasn't a huge increase, but it definitely was an increase over the prior 90 days. And again, that goes in line with the trending of buyers being in a more advantageous position. So these are some things for folks to keep in mind. Switching course a little bit, but because it's just happened, if you recall, I've been making sports predictions, and prior to the NFL playoffs starting, I picked the Philadelphia Eagles to be the Super Bowl champions. And lo and behold, they were. So I've got to pat myself on the back a little bit. But I also have to say that I didn't expect such a one-sided game. I thought it would be a more competitive game. And really, the Super Bowl was over by halftime. The Philadelphia Eagles were just dominant in all aspects of the game. In fact, myself, I turned the game off in the middle of the third quarter and did other activities because it wasn't a very competitive game. The Eagles' dominance was highlighted by all aspects, both their offensive and defensive lines tremendously outclassed Kansas City. And that impacted also the quarterback play. The quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles, Jalen Hurts, had an excellent game, where the quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes, who's considered by many people to be the best quarterback that we've seen for some time since Tom Brady retired, he probably had the worst game I've ever seen him play. You could tell he was just not comfortable with the game. He was scrambling for his life, and he was rushing his throws. And that was all predicated because he was getting so much pressure from the Eagles' defensive line. So anyway, congrats to the Philadelphia Eagles. And they look like they should be well positioned to be a factor for the next few years. The only variable you'll ever get in the NFL is how many players do you lose, because with a stringent salary cap, as players come up for big raises or their contracts come up for what we call renewal, sometimes you can't keep all the players, and sometimes your salary cap ramifications affect your roster. So we'll see how the Eagles have to navigate that. But anyway, it's good for a changing of the guard. Unless you were a Kansas City Chiefs fan, you were probably ready for a new team to ascend to the top of the NFL pyramid. The NBA has taken a brief hiatus. This is All-Star Weekend, and so all the best players in the NFL congregate and have an All-Star game. They've changed formats this year because the exhibition game previously in the All-Star game was really not a very well-played game. There was no defense being played. So they've tried to make it more competitive by branching out to 4 teams this year. So we'll see how that goes. That game will be this coming Sunday, February 16th, for those of you that are NBA fans. And baseball is starting spring training. And probably the biggest news in baseball are 2 things. Number one, the Los Angeles Dodgers, who are the defending world champions, on paper look to be just dominant over their competition. That's caused because they seemingly have an unlimited budget, and their payroll this year will be almost $400 million. And they've loaded up their roster with tremendous acquisitions. A lot of people are feeling that's an unfair scenario because in baseball, if you're willing to pay what I call penalty taxes for increasing your payroll beyond a certain limit, you have no limit on what your payroll is. And the Dodgers seemingly have unlimited resources, so they're spending money tremendously. And so on paper, it looks like they should be a dominant team. The other news is kind of on the opposite spectrum, and that's the Tampa Bay Rays, kind of the home team for Central Florida fans. Tampa Bay has worked at a tremendous disadvantage ever since their inception. They kind of had a below-average ballpark, what they call the Trop, which was a dome facility in St. Petersburg, which was not well located from a convenience standpoint and really was not designed for baseball. At the same time, that impacted the Tampa team because since they weren't drawing enough people, they always had trouble in terms of salaries. So they've never been able to retain their top players for any length of time because they did a great job of talent acquisition of young players. But as these top players ascended to a more premium level, their market value went up significantly, and Tampa Bay was unable to retain their services. They did navigate that quite well because they had a tremendous farm system and they made some very good acquisitions, and they were able to kind of grow their roster. Players that they got in a lot of times that weren't as well regarded, Tampa Bay got premium results from them. But what's occurring now is really going to affect them. And with the hurricanes that we had in the summer of 2024, it did substantial damage to their facility. So they're not playing there in 2025. They may not play there in 2026. So at least for 2025, they're playing in the New York Yankees minor league facility in Tampa. While it's a nice stadium for minor leagues, it's only going to seat about 11 or 12,000 people if it's 100% filled. So that's going to, again, tremendously limit the Tampa Bay revenues, because even if they sell out every game, they're just not going to be able to compete. The average team in Major League Baseball draws between the 20s and the 30s in terms of thousands of fans per game, where Tampa Bay is going to be limited to a maximum of 11 or 12,000 this year. So that's going to create a greater economic imbalance. And we saw that last year with Tampa Bay, because they had gotten rid of some of their higher payroll players, and they had arguably the worst hitting team in the league last year. And even though their pitching was pretty good, I think they scored the second least runs in the league. And quite frankly, they weren't as interesting to watch from a spectator standpoint, because they didn't hit many home runs and all their games were low scoring. So it's unfortunate that baseball allows this imbalance. And if Tampa Bay doesn't rectify their stadium issues, they may ultimately move. From my opinion, I never understood why Orlando hasn't gotten Tampa to move over here. Unfortunately, our elected leaders in Orlando have not really been very proactive in trying to make it more appealing to get the team to consider moving here. And it doesn't seem like Walt Disney World wants to be affiliated with a baseball team. They were affiliated years ago with the team in Anaheim near their Disneyland facility, but I guess they didn't feel it was profitable enough. But picture if we had a stadium near I-4 between Orlando and Tampa. Not only would you appeal to a couple of major metropolitan areas, but think about all the tourists that Disney and Universal get, and you get a lot of families, of course, with young kids, but there's not as much adult activity, especially in Disney. You're going there for the kids. So especially for sports fans, maybe you're coming here from New York, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C. area. All these areas have baseball teams, and a lot of them have very loyal and older fans. So if they could combine a trip to our tourist destination at the same time that their hometown team is playing in the Orlando market, and baseball is good family entertainment, so you would have some families that go down here to go to the theme parks and at the same time go to see a baseball game. At the same time, I think that would increase tourism, because a lot of adults that are not really hardcore Disney fans may not want to stay at Disney as long, other than the fact that they want to have their kids have a memorable vacation. So this would just be another boon to our Orlando economy. But again, our local government, since I've lived in Orlando, has been very erratic. And unfortunately, Pat Williams, who was one of the founders of the Orlando Magic and had pushed for years for Major League Baseball, but was frustrated by the lack of progress, he unfortunately passed away in 2024. So we don't have anybody spearheading that effort. But it's something to consider, and if you agree with me, let's get proactive and write our elected officials to give that some thought. And instead of giving all the money to the hotels and the International Drive. So that's it for sports. Last but not least, if you've been following kind of our government in action in the news and some of the changes, you've probably seen that Elon Musk, all of a sudden, the enigmatic multi-billionaire who's, let's just say he's a unique individual, he took over Twitter and cut staff dramatically, was supposedly very hard to work for, had a lot of resignations. He's now involved in his mind, downsizing and eliminating the waste in government. But they've tried to put forced downsizing on a lot of government employees in Washington, D.C. So a lot of that stuff's in the court system already. The only thing I'll say is I empathize with the government employees because obviously the government is a big employer in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. And most of the folks are middle-class people with families, and they may have worked there for a number of years. And so now they're getting these notices that the government could be downsized dramatically, and they were given an option to take 8 months of severance pay to immediately submit their resignation notice. That particular deadline just came and went, but the scary thing for these employees, besides technically being forced to resign if they choose to take that option, there was really no guarantee they'd get paid. And you're probably scratching your head, well, how can they offer them severance pay if there was no guarantee? Well, simply, this was not, it hasn't been ruled if this is legal, but more importantly, there hasn't been money allocated for that. For the government to function, they have to have funds allocated by Congress when they do the budget resolutions every year. And obviously, there was no money allocated in 2024 for 8 months of severance pay for thousands and thousands of employees. I believe from what I've read, supposedly 80 or 90,000 employees have submitted resignation notices for this forced resignation, but they're basically in limbo right now. You know, you can have your own opinions on whether you think the government is bloated, whether you think it's inefficient, or whatever the case may be. Number one, it's hard to verify that because you hear a lot of propaganda on both sides of the aisle. But the main thing is you need government. When we have hurricanes, when we have mass tragedies, when we have FEMA and all these other things, who does everybody come to for help and funds? The government. Sure, you could say the government may not function as efficiently as you like, but we've had this argument ever since I've been alive, and regardless of who's been in office, there's always been that perception that the government is inefficient. But that's always caused in large measure, too, when you supervise a lot of employees, which in this case the government has a lot of them, you know, it's hard to be as on top of things as you would be in a smaller private organization. I've never heard that the states are all that efficient in their government services either, but the federal government tends to be the whipping boy of everybody. I just think, you know, one of the problems in our country, in my opinion, and it's gotten exacerbated over the years, is when we have a change of administration, we want to do things so dramatically. And there's no question that things could improve and maybe things should be changed, but you can't transition from A to Z without a transition period. We're a country of overreaction. And when we overreact, it creates just as many problems as when we underreact. We need to get more of a sane, moderated approach. But there's so much propaganda and misinformation that's thrown out there that unfortunately these things happen. And I don't know if folks agree with me, but I can tell you, regardless of your political affiliation, we don't want to be in a country where, number one, every time we change administrations, we get a ton of executive orders, which end up being changed all the time. Our country wasn't really founded on executive orders. It was founded on the three branches of government. And increasingly, they're trying to diminish the effects of Congress. And I'm not saying whether Congress has done a good job or not, but I'm saying is I want checks and balances, because if you give the executive branch, or in this case the president, unfettered power, you're copying authoritarian countries like Russia, Cuba, and the things that we fight against all the time. Do we want to be a copycat of this, where the average citizen has no control over their destiny? I know I talked with so many people nowadays, and they've turned off the news, and that's scary too. They're not informed, but they do that because they're so depressed by the news. There's so much anxiety when people hear all these dramatic changes and upheaval. People are so concerned they'd rather stay in a state of bliss by not being informed. And by not being informed, you kind of give the dictator type of mentality even more power, because there's less resistance to it. As I've mentioned on previous podcasts, I'm more of an independent thinker, and I think that both parties, quite honestly, are not very good in this country. And I would love if we had a rational third party that actually represented the majority of folks, not these extreme points of view that we're getting from both parties. One party obviously is characterized as being ultra-liberal and being kind of, for lack of a better term, what you refer to as a woke mentality. The other party is so draconian on the conservative side of doing things that are just extreme. And I think both approaches are just full of problems. I wish I didn't have to talk about politics on this, because this is a real estate show. But politics do affect real estate. And just like right now with these tariffs that are proposed, most economic experts feel that this is going to increase inflation, that inflation itself had been moderated quite a bit in 2024, and it was about 2.5%. But now they're very concerned that inflation is going to start increasing again, and there's just a lot of uncertainty right now. So that's all for today. I hope everyone has a great holiday weekend, and we have President's Day coming up on Monday. Everyone stay healthy, enjoy our nicer weather that we're getting in Florida. We've warmed up, and hopefully the cold spells are diminishing. And that's it for me. So everybody have a great one, and this is Marty Kaiser out.